In the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks a sentence that creates immediate confusion among his closest followers. He looks at his disciples and says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples instantly feel a wave of profound relief. They reply, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." But then comes a sudden, jarring shift in the narrative. John writes that Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. Seeing their misunderstanding, Jesus sets aside the figure of speech and says to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." Why did Jesus begin by describing death as a sleep, only to immediately step down into plain language and declare that Lazarus was dead? Was he simply softening the blow of bad news, or was he opening a door into a reality that human language struggles to contain? If you have ever stood beside an open grave or felt the quiet, lingering weight of your own mortality, this exchange in John chapter 11 is not just an ancient grammatical riddle. It touches the absolute deepest tension of human existence. When breath leaves a body, is that person lost to silence forever? Or does death change its very nature when the Creator enters the room? To understand why Jesus spoke this way, we have to step into the raw emotion and the intense atmosphere of physical danger that surrounds this story. The drama actually begins outside of Judea. In the previous chapter, John chapter 10, the text reveals that Jesus had recently attended the festival of dedication during the winter. There, he faced a violent confrontation in Jerusalem, where religious leaders had taken up stones in a direct attempt to execute him. Following that terrifying threat, Jesus withdrew across the Jordan River, returning to the place where John the Baptist had ministered, putting physical distance between himself and the epicenter of hostility. It is into this tense, fragile exile that a messenger suddenly arrives. He has traveled from Bethany, a small village located just 2 miles outside the hostile gates of Jerusalem. The message he carries is brief, bearing the quiet, desperate panic of 2 sisters who are watching their brother sink under a severe illness. "Lord, the one you love is sick." Here, John introduces one of the most agonizing paradoxes in all of Scripture. In verses 5 and 6, the apostle explicitly writes, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days." Love and delay are bound together in the very same breath. To Mary and Martha, sitting in the suffocating quiet of a sick room in Bethany as their brother's pulse slowed and eventually stopped, those 2 days of divine silence must have felt utterly insufferable. They had seen Jesus heal strangers. They had heard the reports of miracles performed for people he had never even met. Yet now, when the brother he loved was actively dying, he did not move. How could a delay that feels exactly like abandonment be the direct consequence of divine love? John does not resolve this paradox immediately. Instead, he allows the agonizing tension of Jesus' delay to hang over the entire narrative, leaving us with a profoundly uncomfortable question. What is God doing when he refuses to intervene in the timeline we demand? When Jesus finally turned to his disciples and announced that it was time to go back to Judea, terror swept through the group. The disciples were stunned. Returning meant walking right back into the jurisdiction of the religious authorities who had just attempted to murder him. They protested immediately, saying, "Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" The disciples were not only afraid for the life of their teacher, they were terrified for their own lives. It was in this atmosphere of intense fear that Jesus introduced the metaphor of sleep. In the original Greek text, John uses the verb koimetai, a form of koimaomai, which means to fall asleep or to be sleeping. Jesus followed this by introducing another specific verb, exipnizo, which means to awaken someone from sleep. To Jesus, the journey back into hostile territory was not a funeral march, it was a rescue mission to awaken a sleeping friend. The disciples, however, seized upon his choice of words in desperation. The disciples assumed that ordinary sleep meant Lazarus might recover without intervention. In their minds, if he was resting, the crisis might be passing, and there was no longer any reason to risk a dangerous journey into Judea. They replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." The word they used is sothesitai, a form of sozo, which carries the meaning to be saved, to be healed, or to be recovered. They interpreted the metaphor through the lens of their own fear, hoping that physical rest would spare them all from a deadly trip back to the shadow of Jerusalem. John says that Jesus spoke plainly. The word parousia conveys open, direct speech. In this moment, Jesus set aside the metaphor and stated the reality in terms the disciples could not misunderstand. He did not let them hide behind a comforting figure of speech. He used the stark, absolute verb apathanon, a form of apothenesko, meaning to die. He declared to them, "Lazarus is dead." Yet even after the reality of Lazarus's death was laid bare, the disciples remained consumed by a dark fatalism. When it became clear that Jesus was determined to go to Bethany despite the danger, Thomas turned to the rest of the group and voiced their collective dread. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Notice the intense narrative irony in Thomas's words. The disciples began their journey down the road to Judea fully convinced that they were walking straight toward their own execution. They were marching in the fear of death, completely blind to the fact that they were walking alongside the one who was about to command a dead man to walk out of a tomb. If studying the original language of Scripture helps you see these passages more clearly, subscribe so our next investigation finds you. And if you would like to support this work, you can join us as a channel member below. As they make the journey toward Bethany, it is crucial to recognize that Jesus did not invent the metaphor of death as sleep out of thin air. Throughout the Old Testament, the death of a king or a patriarch was frequently described with the phrase, "He slept with his ancestors." The prophet Daniel, in chapter 12 of his book, spoke beautifully of those who sleep in the dust of the earth awakening to life. By picking up this biblical vocabulary, Jesus was connecting to an ancient, deeply rooted hope. But the radical novelty was not the metaphor itself, it was the stunning personal authority he attached to it. He did not merely say that Lazarus was sleeping the sleep of his ancestors. He declared, "I am going there to wake him up." Jesus took a poetic image of future hope and transformed it into an immediate, present-tense action that he himself would perform. By the time Jesus and his disciples finally arrived on the outskirts of Bethany, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. This specific time frame is the answer to the bitter mystery of the 2-day delay, and it carries immense historical weight. A later rabbinic tradition, preserved in texts like the Leviticus Rabbah, may preserve an earlier Jewish belief that the soul remained near the body for 3 days after death, departing permanently only when decomposition began to alter the appearance of the face. While we cannot prove that this specific belief was universally held by everyone in first-century Judea, the narrative of John makes the physical implications of the 4th day completely undeniable. By waiting 2 days to travel, Jesus ensured that he would arrive long after any human hope could remain. Lazarus was deep in the grave. Martha was expecting the horrific odor of severe decomposition. There was absolutely no possibility of confusing this situation with a swoon, a coma, or a natural sleep. The physical consequences of death had taken their full, devastating course. When Martha heard that Jesus was approaching, she left the mourning house and ran out to meet him on the road. Her very first words are heavy with a painful mixture of grief and unspoken questions. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Martha believed completely in the healing power of Jesus, but she assumed that his power was bound by the constraints of time and physical proximity. In her mind, his late arrival meant that death had secured a final victory. Yet in the very next breath, she adds an astonishing statement of faith. "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Martha's heart is a storm of conflicting emotions. She mixes profound pain with deep trust, quiet frustration with an incomplete, searching hope. She does not fully grasp what she is asking, but she knows that Jesus is still the answer. When Jesus tells her, "Your brother will rise again," Martha responds with standard Orthodox theology. "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Unlike the Sadducees who denied the resurrection, Martha possessed a solid Pharisaic belief in the future resurrection promised by the prophets. But to her, the resurrection was a distant event on the eschatological calendar. It was a theological concept, far removed from the cold, agonizing reality of her brother's rotting body in a cave. Jesus does not correct her belief in the final resurrection. He shatters its boundaries and brings it crashing into the present moment. He looks at her and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Resurrection is not just an event that happens on the last day. Resurrection is a person standing on the dusty road outside Bethany. Jesus was revealing that resurrection power is not something that requires waiting for the end of time, because the source of life himself was looking her in the eyes. Following this incredible revelation, Martha goes back to the house and quietly calls her sister Mary. Mary quickly gets up and rushes to the place where Jesus is waiting. The large crowd of mourners, friends, and neighbors who had come to comfort the grieving family follow her, assuming she is going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary reaches Jesus, she falls at his feet. Through her tears, she speaks the exact same sentence her sister had spoken moments before. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But while Martha had engaged in a theological dialogue and tried to organize her faith in the midst of her pain, Mary simply falls and weeps. And Jesus meets each sister precisely within her own specific form of suffering. He offered profound truth to Martha. To Mary, he offers his own broken heart. Seeing Mary weeping and the crowd of friends wailing around her, John writes that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek word translated as deeply moved is embrimaomai. In ancient literature, this word was sometimes used to describe the intense, angry snorting of a horse. It conveys a profound sense of perturbation, agitation, or even indignation. The narrative context allows us to see more than passive sadness in his reaction. As he witnesses the tears of those he loves, Jesus is experiencing a visceral, holy indignation against the devastation that death inflicts upon the human family. Then comes one of the most famously brief and emotionally staggering verses in English translations, John chapter 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. Consider the immense contradiction of this moment. Jesus knows with absolute certainty that the miracle is only minutes away. He knows that Lazarus is about to walk out of the tomb alive. Even with that glorious reality standing right on the horizon, he still weeps. His tears prove that the promise of future hope does not make present pain false. Faith in the resurrection does not require an emotionless insensitivity to the tragedy of loss. Jesus did not call death a sleep to trivialize our sorrow. He called death a sleep to guarantee our hope. Jesus then moves to the tomb itself. It was a cave, and a large stone lay across the entrance. Standing before the heavy rock that separated the living from the dead, Jesus gives a command that shocks everyone present. Take away the stone. Martha, ever practical, instantly objects. She warns him of the gruesome reality waiting behind the rock. "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." She is pointing to the absolute, undeniable physical evidence of decay. But Jesus reminds her of his promise, saying, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they take away the stone. In the heavy, suffocating silence that follows, Jesus does not perform a secret ritual or utter a magical incantation. He simply lifts his eyes to heaven and prays publicly to the Father, explicitly stating that he is praying aloud so that the crowd standing there will believe that he was sent by God. Then, he looks into the dark mouth of the cave and calls out in a loud, commanding voice, "Lazarus, come out!" Early Christian preachers and commentators loved to observe a beautiful homiletical truth about this moment. They suggested that Jesus had to call Lazarus specifically by name, because if he had simply shouted, "Come out," into a graveyard, the sheer resurrection authority of his voice would have emptied every tomb in the region. Out of the darkness, the man who had been dead for 4 days walks out. His hands and feet are still bound in linen wrappings, and a cloth is tied around his face. The physical evidence of his death is still clinging to his body. Jesus looks at the stunned, silent crowd and issues the final command, "Unbind him and let him go." In this moment, it is important to distinguish the resurrection of Lazarus from the final resurrection promised to all believers. Lazarus was brought back to a mortal life. He would eventually age and he would have to die again. His emergence from the tomb was a miraculous sign, a temporary anticipation of the definitive, permanent victory over death that Jesus himself would achieve on Easter morning. Yet this unprecedented miracle sent shockwaves far beyond the village of Bethany, leading to severe and immediate consequences. In John chapter 11, verses 45 through 53, the narrative reveals the dark political fallout of the resurrection. Many of the people who witnessed the miracle put their faith in Jesus, but others went straight to the Pharisees to report what they had seen. The Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish council, hurriedly gathered. They realized that a public sign of this magnitude could not be ignored, and they feared that the growing crowds following Jesus would bring the wrath of the Roman Empire down upon their nation. The high priest, Caiaphas, stood up and delivered a cold, pragmatic verdict, declaring that it was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. From that very day, the council officially began plotting to take the life of Jesus. Later in John chapter 12, we learn that the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, because his continued breathing existence was living proof of the miracle. Here's the heartbreaking, magnificent irony of the story. The voice that called Lazarus out of the grave also set in motion the plot that would place Jesus inside one. By calling his friend back to life, Jesus actively brought his own death closer. He walked into Judea fully knowing the cost, willingly exchanging his safety for the life of the one he loved. The profound impact of this event permanently altered the vocabulary of the early church. Long after the ascension of Jesus, the apostles continued to use the language of sleep to describe the death of believers. In Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is stoned to death, the text says that he fell asleep. When the apostle Paul wrote to a grieving community in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he comforted them by speaking of those who sleep in death, promising that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. This enduring biblical hope even changed the physical landscape of the ancient world. In the Greco-Roman culture, burial grounds were often seen as places of permanent finality. But early Christians adopted an existing Greek word, koimeterion, and gave it a radically new funerary application. Koimeterion was not a word invented by Christians. It was an ordinary term that meant a dormitory, a sleeping room, or a place of rest. By applying koimeterion to their burial sites, early Christians were making a profound theological statement. They were poetically contrasting the hopeless idea of a city of the dead with the confident expectation of a sleeping place. They were declaring that their graves were not monuments of absolute finality, but temporary resting places where bodies wait for the morning of the resurrection. It is from this specific linguistic trajectory that our modern English word cemetery was born. Why did Jesus say Lazarus was asleep and then say he was dead? He said Lazarus was dead because he refused to let his disciples hide behind a metaphor. He forced them to confront the terrifying, unvarnished reality of death, making it absolutely clear that human effort is powerless before the grave. But he began by calling death a sleep because he was revealing what human mortality actually becomes when it is subjected to the authority of the Son of God. In human language, death is a final period at the end of a tragic sentence. In the language of Jesus, death for the believer is merely a comma. When you find yourself standing in the ruins of grief, wrestling with the paradox of a God who loves you but sometimes delays his rescue, remember the road to Bethany. The silence of God is not the absence of God. The tears of Jesus prove that your pain is sacred, and the voice that commanded the tomb to open proves that your hope is secure. The one who paid the ultimate price to conquer the grave is not just a distant theological promise. He is the resurrection and the life, standing with you in the present moment, holding the absolute power to awaken those who sleep. Which part of this passage, the strange delay, the tears of Jesus, or the command at the tomb, speaks most deeply to your faith today? Let us know in the comments below.